Welcome, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Day, and I'm the Associate Director for Policy and Training Initiatives with the Bronfenbrenner Center, and I am delighted to welcome you to our third talk in the Talks at 12 series, the Pathways to Social Justice series that we're running this year. This is our last talk for this semester, but please check out the schedule. We have more awesome talks coming in the spring. We're also launching a new virtual talk series, the Research Practice Partnership Series. It's a collaboration with the Einhorn Center. And our first talk for that will be on December 9th. We're hosting Melody Goodman from NYU, and she's gonna talk about the science of stakeholder engagement, really thinking about how to measure research practice partnerships and their effectiveness. And you can find more information on that on our website. And also just a reminder, if you're joining us online today, please submit questions. I'll be keeping an eye on those in the chat box, and then I can bring those up as needed at the end of the talk. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Adam J. Hoffman. Dr. Hoffman is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Cornell. He investigates the development of social identities among adolescents, their implications for academic achievement, motivation, and mental health and well-being, and ways social identities can be leveraged to enhance academic and psychosocial outcomes. He earned a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from Quinnipiac University, practice that, and a Master of Arts and Ph.D. in Developmental Psychology from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He then completed two postdocs, the first in the Department of Psychology and School of Education at the University of Michigan, and the second in the Department of Psychology at North Carolina State University. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Hoffman.
Well, hi there, folks. I am so excited and grateful to be here today. And thank you for being here on this dreary November day. I know it's a tough time of the semester, so I really appreciate you all being here for this talk. I first want to, of course, respectfully acknowledge the Gainakono, or the Cayuga Nation, the homelands whose many of us we live and work on every day here at Cornell University. And I also want to say that I'm really grateful and humbled to be able to present this research during the month of November. Of course, this is American Indian Heritage Month, so I think that it's really great to be able to kind of highlight the voices of Native American youth during this month. And so for my talk today, with recent research that I've been doing, I'm going to be taking us to Indian country to highlight and share about some of the experiences of Cherokee youth specifically. But before I jump into my research and the research that I've been doing specifically with the Cherokee, I want to go ahead and just give you a bit of an understanding of who I am and how I became interested in what I research. And I also recognize in here that everybody might not know that much about Native Americans, specifically Cherokee. So I'm going to be providing you with some information about the nation and also Native Americans more broadly, just to give you a better understanding of the context in which I do my research. So I study the development of ethnic, racial, and gender identities in adolescence. And so for my presentation today, I really wanted to start with this quote from Chief Seattle. I think this is really great because he really does a great job of kind of imparting Indigenous wisdom about the importance of identities and identity development. So here's the quote. Chief Seattle said, "When you know who you are, when your mission is clear, and when you burn with the inner fire of unbreakable will, no cold can touch your heart, no deluge can dampen your purpose, you know that you are alive." And I think this quote is really great because Chief Seattle said this over 150 years ago. And this is long before when we've been talking about identity and contemporary psychological theory. And so I think this does a really great job of showing how Indigenous wisdom and ways of knowing have been prevalent through time and long before we've been thinking about these with contemporary psychological science and research. But I think this quote also shows the importance of identities, particularly identities in Native American communities. So the question that is really kind of at the core of my program of research and what I want to try to understand and study is this question right here. How can we leverage social identities to enhance well-being? How can we take social identities, a phenomenon that most all of us have, and kind of leverage them for the good, in essence? How can we take them and use them to really improve our lives in some kind of way? And there's two main ways that I'm kind of interested in looking at how we can do this, okay? The first way is protecting from negative effects, right? So we know that sometimes we have these negative experiences in our lives. What ways can we use social identities to kind of shield us from some of those negative effects, especially on these moments where we have these negative effects on these social identities that we do carry with us? So moments of discrimination, bias, and other forms of prejudice. But I'm also interested in how we can enhance positive adjustment, because we know from our research that social identities, when we have a stronger, more positive social identity in who we are, it's oftentimes related to better outcomes for kids. So how can we kind of boost our identities to then further enhance our sense of self and who we are? So that's the two main ways that I want to kind of try to use social identities to enhance the lives of people. And this is a very applied question, right? This is something that's like taking social identities to the real world. How can we use social identities to then kind of shape their lives? But of course, to be able to do this kind of applied research, we have to have a basic understanding of social identities, right? We have to be able to know and understand these phenomenon and how they're working in this time of adolescence in particular that I study. So in my first line of research, I'm really interested in understanding how do social identities develop? So how are they changing over time in adolescence? Adolescence does represent a time when we're starting to see social identities come online for the very first time. And so that we want to understand how are they changing over time, because this is something that is happening in adolescence. Also want to understand what are some of the factors that could be influencing this development, right? In my second line of research, I aim to understand how social identities are related to outcomes. And I'm talking about beyond just a bivariate correlation level with different kind of outcomes, because we've established that in psychological science. Again, more positive sense of self, a stronger sense of self on your identities and who you are, better outcomes. But how does the context play a role in these relationships? Who's influencing these relationships? Parents, peers, teachers. And how are different kinds of situations that these kids are in could be influencing these relationships to these outcomes for kids. So that's what I've done in my second line of research. And then finally, in my third line of research here is really kind of my applied translational intervention research here. And moving from can we leverage social identities to how do we shape social identities to enhance well-being, right? So it's moving to how can we start, now that we have this basic information of social identities, how can we then use that information to intervene and shape social identities to really enhance the well-being of the lives of kids. So that's my program of research there. If you couldn't tell, my program of research is heavily steeped in the ecological systems theory, which is of course Urie Bronfenbrenner's theoretical model. And then I'm really interested in understanding how psychological experiences are shaped by the context, by the different systems of context that individuals are in, all the way from the individual level, so their gender or their own ethnicity and race, all the way to kind of larger contextual factors from the macro system, like attitudes and ideologies of the culture that they're in. So that's kind of the theoretical perspective that underlies my program of research. And I've done this research with youth from an array of ethnic, racial, minority backgrounds, focusing specifically on these four groups. But of course, today, the research that I'm going to be presenting and talking about is my research with Native Americans, specifically with the Cherokee. And it's really important to do this research because I want to point out kind of the shifting demographic trends of our country that we live in here in the United States. I want you to look at these two bars here. These two bars represent 2010 and 2018 population. It's broken down by race and ethnicity. And then those dark blue bars and the bars that are above it are the bars that represent the racial ethnic minorities in the United States. And what you can see here is that we're actually seeing increases in these dark blue bars and the bars above it, indicating that we have greater diversity just within the span of an 8-year period here in the United States. So we have an increasing diversity, and so we need to capture those experiences in developmental science and psychology. And this is especially true among our most diverse group, which is our youth here under the age of 18, as over a majority of them now represent ethnic racial minority youth. And so with this kind of increasing diversity that we have in the United States, I really want to make sure and try to understand and know that our science is keeping up with this and really making sure that we're capturing the experiences of all youth. I was particularly interested in the experiences of Native American youth and understanding to what extent they're being captured, especially in developmental science. So I went ahead and looked at the top 4 developmental psychology journals in our field to see how many research articles I could find that focused specifically on Native American youth. And here's what I found. Across the 4 journals in the past 20 years, we had 19 articles. It's less than 1 a year that we're experiencing, it just focuses exclusively on the experiences of Native American children. I was not surprised, but still disappointed by this fact, and really thought that this is problematic and something that needs to be addressed. So I've actually been working with the editor at Child Development, and we're going to be co-editing a special section in Child Development that's called Highlighting Indigenous Child Development Edges and Possibilities in State-of-Art Research. So the call is going to be coming out in January. Keep your eyes peeled if you do developmental research with kids, because there is going to be this special section. I'm really excited that this is going to be eventually put out there to really highlight more developmental experiences for Native American children. Okay, so I just want to contextualize a little bit about Native Americans in the US, and specifically in North Carolina, where I did my research with the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. So Native Americans represent the smallest of the major ethnic racial minority groups in the United States. They have 2.9 million, or 0.09% or 0.9% identify as Native American only in the census. 29% are under the age of 18. This is indicating that there's a relatively large youth population among Native Americans, right? Almost 1/3 of them are under the age of 18. So there's a lot of Native American youth within this population. There's 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States alone, and there's 324 that have federal reservation land. There's also tribes that only have state recognition but don't have federal recognition. And there's even some tribes that don't have state or federal recognition. All of this is to say is that there's a lot of heterogeneity in the experiences of Native American people. We use that very broad pan-ethnic term of Native American or American Indian, but the experiences are so varied and different given the vast diversity of these different tribes that we have in their locations. So as I speak to my research, I would speak to it as much as possible to Cherokee, because that's the experiences of the Cherokee that I captured with my research. Okay, so in this graph here, this map of the United States, we have the Native American population by state. Those that are in blue have less population, and those that are in orange and red have more population of Native Americans. And what you can see here is that those that have the greatest areas are the Great Plains of the Midwest, the Pacific Northwest, and the Southeast, or Southwest here. And as you can see on the East Coast, there's really not much of a population, right, of Native Americans. And of course, this isn't by accident and really is an artifact of the United States colonization and attempted genocide of Native Americans, as many tribes, particularly those in the East, were moved to the West or just completely eliminated, but moved to undesired territories in the West. So that's not an accident. That's why there's so few Native American people in the eastern part of our country. So this line that I've just placed here is roughly where the Mississippi River flows here. So you can see there's really only one state east of the Mississippi River that has any kind of significant population of Native American, that being North Carolina, of course. I do want to give a caveat to New York State. New York State does have the largest Native American population of any state east of the Mississippi River. However, given in proportion to its population, it has less compared to North Carolina. Okay, so I want to zoom in just on North Carolina for a second here. North Carolina has 8 state recognized tribes and 4 urban Indian organizations. It's highlighted here on this map. However, only one of them does have a federal recognition status and is recognized by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and that's the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. And they're in the western part of the state here, highlighted in red. The Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians are located in western North Carolina. As I mentioned, their reservation land is adjacent to the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. It's important for me to note that in the 1800s, the Cherokee were part of 5 tribes that made attempts to assimilate to mainstream white culture. However, this was not recognized by Andrew Jackson, and he enacted what was the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which forced these tribes to move to the Indian Territory, what is now known today as Oklahoma. And so these are the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Cherokee, Creek, and the Seminole. They were all designated to move to the Indian Territory on what we know today as infamously known today as the Trail of Tears. However, some folks in Cherokee were able to find ways to stay within Cherokee and be able to remain in their homelands. And so because of that, they were then able to establish what we know today as the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, compared to the Cherokee Nation, which is located in Oklahoma today. So there's the Eastern Band in Western North Carolina, and then there's the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma. Okay. That's a little bit of the history, but I want to focus on the here and now and today, and that Cherokee is a vibrant, thriving, sovereign Native nation. There's over 16,000 enrolled members of the tribe, and they are doing awesome. They have an amazing casino that has really leveraged a lot of economic assets for the community to be able to do lots of things in terms of cultural engagement, and really just be able to kind of thrive and flourish and be this really exciting place to be. And so great place to be able to do my research and be a part of this community here. Okay, so now that I've contextualized, explained who I am, and done all this front work, I'm ready to talk a little bit about research here. And so that's what I'm gonna do. So first I'm gonna be talking about ethnic racial identity and gender identity, two social identities, and their relationship to well-being, particularly among the Cherokee youth. Okay, so social identities in adolescence. Adolescence is that time of increased awareness of the self, right? So kids can do categorization of their race and then their gender pretty early. They know that they can be a boy or that they might be Cherokee. But it's really in adolescence when they start to ascribe and attach meanings of those identities to their sense of self and who they are, and can actually have really then implications for things like their mental health and well-being, but also things like academic motivation and achievement. There's two social identities that are particularly salient, especially as we're developing in adolescence, that being gender identity and ethnic racial identity. And we also know that these two identities are very important as they relate to a lot of different outcomes for kids. But we know less about research with Native American samples. Probably not a surprise to a lot of folks in here. There's not that much that we know about these Native American samples compared to Black and Latinx samples in particular. That's something that I felt there was a gap that needed to be filled. We've done a little bit of research with Native Americans, looking at the relationship between ethnic racial identity and well-being, but I couldn't find anything that looked at gender identity in Native American populations and well-being. So I knew that this was a gap that was going to be filled with this research. I took an intersecting identities or intersectional lens to my research. So I know that and many of us know that we have lots of different social identities that we carry with us at any given time, and that those different social identities kind of create a constellation of identities to make up who we are. And this constellation of social identities kind of colors our worldview, right? And kind of, helps us to kind of see through lenses that are maybe different from the person who's next to you, who carries other kinds of different social identities. So it's important to kind of try to understand and subscribe to this idea and understand that these experiences could be different on the basis of social identities that people carry with them. And so I'll show you how I do that in this research that I'm presenting today. Thinking a little bit more about ethnic, racial, and gender identities, there's lots of different ways that we can measure these social identities, lots of different conceptualizations. But for my studies, I study and look at the content of social identities. So what social identities are made of. In particular, there's three dimensions. First is centrality. So how central or important is the social identity to you? So if you're Cherokee, how important is Cherokee to your overall sense of self and who you are? I look at private regard as well. So private regard is how do you feel about being Cherokee? Or how do you feel about being a girl or a boy, for example? Do you feel like this is something that's positive or something that you just don't really care about or something that even is potentially negative? This is how do you personally feel about this? Next is public regard. How do you think other people view your group? So how do you think other people view Cherokee people? How do you think other people view Cherokees as a group, as a people, and who they are? So those are the three main dimensions that I study in terms of social identities. And we know, again, that social identities are developing and changing as they advance through adolescence. So in the study, we might expect to see some developmental change happening. I have cross-sectional data, so I couldn't look at change over time. But I do have different grade levels, so I was able to look at grade level differences to see if there were going to be differences across the grade levels. I was also interested in looking at gender differences in these social identities. And I'm not just talking about gender identity, also looking at gender differences potentially in ethnic racial identity, and I'll explain why. But first, for gender identity, boys typically tend to have stronger gender identities compared to girls. And this is because oftentimes the male gender identity has and affords lots of different privileges that boys can carry with them. So typically they have a stronger and more positive association with their gender identity compared to girls. But for girls, what we actually see is that girls actually typically have stronger ethnic racial identities compared to boys. And this is especially true with Indigenous populations and with Cherokee specifically, because girls are oftentimes kind of seen as the bearers of culture and customs and traditions within their communities. And so because of that, then, they're able to kind of, have to carry that with them. And so subsequently, they may have a stronger and more positive ethnic racial identity. And then just thinking about relationships to outcomes for these identities. So the dimensions of identities are related to psychosocial and mental health outcomes. We've seen that in the literature very consistently, but at a very bivariate correlation level. So looking at just one dimension of identity and then looking at that in relationship to self-esteem or well-being. But rarely in our research have we ever kind of looked at these across different dimensions within different social identities. And so that was a gap in the literature as well. And that's something I wanted to look at. So how do we account for the multiple gender and ethnic racial identity dimensions that we have in one model? And that's something I wanted to do in this outcome, or in this study. So just to go over the research questions here again, are there grade differences? Are we going to see those developmental trends or differences that we might expect to see in these dimensions of identity? Second question, are there gender differences in these dimensions of identity as we might expect to see? And then the third question here is, how do identities relate to psychosocial well-being? And specifically, do some of these dimensions relate to well-being more strongly when taking into account these other dimensions of ethnic, racial, and gender identity, okay? Okay, so just to give you a little bit of background about the participants, I had 212 Cherokee adolescents, about 13 years old. They were all citizens of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, and they came from 3 different middle schools. One was a tribal school and 2 were public schools. And there's the breakdown. A majority of them did come from the tribal school, as you can see there. They were all adolescents in middle school, so it's grades 6, 7, and 8. Pretty even gender balance, as you can see here, just a few more girls than boys, but pretty balanced. And you can see here's a grade by gender breakdown, pretty even slices of the pies that you can see across the different groups, their gender by grade. This study was part of a larger study that was with an intervention that was kind of aimed to boost STEM motivation. I'll be talking about that in the third study. But this all happened at pre-intervention before I even tried intervening. So no manipulations have happened at this point yet. Okay, so to measure these different dimensions of identity, I'm going to go through some example items for you to just let you know what the kids were reading as they were filling out these surveys, okay? So for gender centrality, I'll read these questions as if I was a girl, and there were 3 items for both of these dimensions. Again, I'll read them as if I was a girl. I feel close to other girls. And for gender private regard, I am happy that I am a girl. So for ethnic identity, for ethnic centrality first, I have a strong sense of belonging for with Cherokee or Native American people. Ethnic private regard, I am proud to be Cherokee or Native American. Ethnic public regard, people think that Cherokee or Native Americans are as good as people from other races. So those are the 3 different dimensions of ethnic racial identity that we assessed. And then to look at well-being, we looked at well-being, 3 different dimensions of that, and self-esteem. So to assess emotional well-being, how often in the past month did you feel interested in life? Social well-being, how often in the past month did you feel that you belong to a community? And psychological well-being, how often in the past month did you feel confident to express your own ideas? For self-esteem, I have a number of good qualities. Okay, so to answer the first question, were there kind of those developmental differences in terms of those age or grade level differences that we might expect to see? We actually only saw one that we found here, and that was actually with ethnic racial public regard. So remember, ethnic racial public regard is the idea of what is your perception of other people's perception of your group, right? So what do you think other people, how do you think other people view Cherokee people, basically? And what we see is there's actually a significant decline here in their perceptions of public regard. So essentially their ideas or their perceptions about Cherokee are actually kind of declining, or what other people view about Cherokee is declining. And this is actually something that we did hypothesize, because as kids are starting to learn more about their social groups that they belong to, they can also start to learn about some of the negative things that are attached to their group, right? And that public perceptions of their group may not always be positive and rosy. And in fact, that they may experience things like discrimination and other forms of prejudice. So this is something that we think that could be happening to see, is that we see that kind of decline in ethnic racial public regard. But all the other dimensions were relatively stable across the different age groups. Again, this is cross-sectional, so I can't say that there's actually no change happening here, but this gives us a nice clue as to whether or not there could be something happening. So this is something I definitely would want to test longitudinally with these kids. Okay. So to think a little bit about some of the gender differences, this is where some really of the more interesting results I think really fleshed out here in looking at the differences, both within the gender and then across the gender groups. So within the gender, so for girls, we actually found that they were their ethnic racial identity was significantly more important to them compared to their gender identity, right? And that's something that we had I talked about and that we might expect to see there, right? That their ethnic identity was more central to who they were compared to their gender identity. But it's almost one whole point, which in our field and study, that's like a lot. That's a very significant difference. And then looking here at private regard, we saw that girls also had significantly higher private regard around their ethnicity compared to their gender, right? So girls felt more positively about being Cherokee compared to feeling positively about their gender group, right? And this is not to say 6 is still pretty high. This is not to say that they didn't feel positively about being a girl. They just felt more positively about being Cherokee, okay? And then for boys here, we actually saw there was no significant differences between the importance of their identity. So they both felt that their ethnic racial identity and their gender identity were important, and that they weren't actually significantly different from each other. Same story for private regard for boys. They both felt that they felt positively about their ethnic racial and gender identity, and there was no distinction between the two, no significant distinction. And then finally, looking at ethnic racial public regard, looking across the two gender groups here, there was no significant difference. For ethnic racial centrality, for girls and boys, they both felt that it was of equal importance in terms of they both felt it was important and they weren't significantly different from each other in terms of their race and ethnicity. But for gender, we do see a significant difference. Boys are rating their gender centrality, their gender identity as more central to who they are compared to those girls. With ethnic racial private regard, no difference in their private regards. They both felt positively about being Cherokee, and there was no difference between boys and girls in that. But again, with gender here, we're seeing a gender difference such that boys are rating their gender identity more positively compared to girls. Okay, so now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about canonical correlations. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of it, but basically, what this allows us to do is to kind of group our two variable groups together. So these are our well-being items and our identity items, okay? It allows us to kind of create a little bit of like what we'd call a latent variable. Don't tell the SEM people that I'm talking about this because it's not actually SEM, but it's something like that in the case that you're into SEM and can understand that. But basically it creates two kinds of like mini variables, one around just identities and one around well-being. And we can kind of look to see what's the overall relationship between these variables and these variables. And we do that through what's called the Wilkes lambda. And the Wilkes lambda here says that there's 51% of the shared variance is explained between these two dimensions. And then we get an effect size of 32.44, which is actually a pretty robust effect size. But more specifically, again, my research questions was to understand what specific dimensions of identity were most important for kind of predicting this kind of well-being outcome. And so we can get these kind of specific direct effects of each of these dimensions to well-being. So we can understand which one is kind of contributing the most, right? And so what we found here was for the boys, they all significantly mattered here. They all significantly predicted and were related to the well-being outcome. But for boys, it was gender private regard. That was the most important aspect of identity. When accounting for all these other dimensions of identity that we know exist, gender private regard was the strongest predictor for boys. Okay, so let's talk about the girls now. For girls, Wilkie's lambda 0.55, that's a large shared variance. And we have an even more robust effect size here, so this is good to go. And then looking at those specific effects, we have a little bit more of a mixed story, okay, with girls, a little bit more complicated, nuanced story. Certainly, gender is a strong predictor of these of the well-being outcomes, with 0.88, 0.80 for those dimensions predicting that well-being outcome. But we cannot discount ethnic racial centrality, which is right up there. That is also an important factor for these girls in predicting their well-being. So this is to say it's a little bit more complicated for girls in that they're really kind of relying and using both forms of the identities, where the boys are really kind of more relying just on their gender identity. So what did we learn? There were those grade level declines in public regard. Boys' identities, they don't distinguish in terms of their importance and the affect of their ethnic, racial, and gender identity. They're both important to them and that they both feel positively about it. But for girls, ERI is just more important and more positive for them compared to their gender identity. And boys have more central and more positive gender identity compared to girls. And both ethnic, racial, and gender identities are important for well-being. For boys, gender identity is more important. And for girls, we get more of a blend between ethnic, racial, and gender identities. Okay, so now I'm going to be moving us to classroom engagement. So oh, got a question? Yeah. No, we did not have any. We had the option though too as well. We had two-spirit, other, trans. Like we actually had a whole bunch, but they all identified as either a boy or girl. Yeah.
And then another question was, you talked more about your position at URI and Detroit and separately. What's the thought on so simultaneously URI and Detroit both take
Yeah, that's a really great question. I love that question because, and for those folks who maybe don't know, there's actually measures now that are just starting to get developed that ask specific questions about, if you were a Cherokee boy, or how is your experience as a Cherokee girl? So they're kind of specific, and that's truly intersectional, right? Because you're really kind of asking about the specific identity on the basis of these two identities and not just one. I think that that's really great, and we just need to develop those measures. And this was kind of just my first foray, kind of like getting in here and working on these kinds of things. So yeah, I think that we should be moving towards that. And I think that as more measures get developed and established, it's certainly something that I would be interested in kind of adding into my program of research as well. Thanks. Okay, so we're gonna just drop gender for just this study. We're just gonna be looking at ethnic racial identity. So don't worry about gender anymore. But I'm interested in also the relationship between ethnic racial identity and education outcomes. So not just like psychosocial well-being or mental health, but also education outcomes as well. And I was also interested in something that's called cultural socialization. And cultural socialization, I'll talk a little bit more about that, but it's just kind of the way that parents talk to their kids about race and ethnicity. And so I was kind of interested in that as a moderator of that relationship. So this is hot off the presses. Well, not quite in the presses yet. Actually, it has some minor revisions that we're going through, but it's looks like it's going to be accepted. So fingers crossed. Yeah. Okay. So again, we're just going to be focusing on ethnic identity and just on those two dimensions for this study of private regard and public regard, your perceptions of the group and how other people perceive your group. Okay. And again, as I've mentioned them before, theory really suggests that if you have a stronger and more positive identity, ethnic racial identity, you're going to have better outcomes because you have a stronger sense of self and who you are, and a more positive sense of self and who you are. And we see that there's a positive link specifically between ethnic racial identity and school engagement for youth. This is a relatively robust finding, especially from youth from across many other kinds of ethnic racial minority backgrounds. However, this is not something that we've seen ever kind of empirically shown with Native American children. And I thought that this was something that's particularly important and that we don't just try to generalize this from other ethnic racial minority groups. Because of the unique experiences that Native American families, children have had around education. Particularly, I'm thinking about boarding schools and kind of the historical trauma that has been passed down from generations to generation around boarding schools, the difficulties that they've had in these contexts. So I didn't want to take this for granted and just say, oh, other ethnic racial minority kids, we see that there's a positive relationship, so we're going to say that that's true for Native American children. That's not what I wanted to, so I wanted to really kind of provide some empirical evidence around this relationship. But like I said, I was also interested in kind of understanding what's the role of parents and how parents could be influencing this relationship with their children between, ethnic racial identity and their school engagement. And I thought of cultural socialization, which again is just the way that parents talk to their children about race and ethnicity. And cultural socialization is something that's been an important aspect of development for Native American families. It's been shown. And there's two main ways that parents can talk to their kids about race. Well, there's lots of different ways, but the two ways that I'm going to be talking about today are pride socialization and preparation for bias, okay? Pride socialization or pride messages are just messages about being prideful of who you are, your culture, history, traditions, customs. And it's not even just like talking to your kid, but it's also like engaging in things. So like behavior, right? So like going to things like the powwow or engaging in like beadwork or basket weaving or other kinds of cultural activities that kids can actually go ahead and engage in. Those can be messages of pride as well. So it's, again, not just like talking at them, but like actually doing things as well, okay? And then there's preparation for bias. Okay, preparation for bias is the idea that, especially as kids get older, sometimes parents are inclined to talk to their kids about, maybe some of the bias and discrimination that they may experience on the basis of their identity, in particular in the case here of being Cherokee. So parents may be, inclined to say, hey, because you're Cherokee, maybe you held back in this kind of way. And then sometimes they tag on some messages of kind of like ways that they can cope with these kinds of experiences of discrimination in particular. So that's just another kind of way that parents talk to their kids about race and ethnicity is through what's called preparation for bias, okay? So again, what I wanted to understand was first, what's the relationship between ethnic racial identity and science classroom engagement specifically? I looked at science because of the STEM intervention that I was doing. What's that relationship? And then how does pride messages, socialization pride messages, augment that relationship? So how does, if a kid gets lots of pride messages, does it enhance or diminish that relationship that we see between ethnic racial identity and their classroom engagement? Same story for preparation for bias as well. To what extent what is the relationship between racial ethnic identity and science classroom engagement, and how does preparation for bias augment it or change that relationship? Does it weaken it or does it enhance that relationship? Okay. I've already talked about ethnic, racial, private regard, and public regard. I'll skip those, but I'll pop in here and give you the example items for pride messages. So there were 6 items that they had to answer. Here's the sample item. During the past year, how often have your parents read or told Cherokee or Native American stories? And then preparation for bias, another 6 items here. During the past year, how often have your parents said that people might try to limit you because you're Cherokee or Native American? And then to look at science classroom engagement and assess that, another 6 items. When I do badly on a science test, I work harder next time. Okay, so lots of numbers here. I'm going to break it down, don't worry, and just show you the most important parts. So first, looking at this moderation analysis that I did, and this is looking at specifically private regard. Private regard was actually a significant predictor of classroom engagement. So it's indicating that higher levels of private regard meant higher levels of classroom engagement. So there was that positive association between ethnic racial identity and their classroom engagement, okay? And that was taking into account pride socialization. And then pride socialization does not have a significant main effect. So didn't really matter the extent to which you got pride socialization measures, didn't have a relationship with their engagement in the classroom. We did see a significant interaction, so I probed that. I'm going to show you guys right now what that looked like. And what we found was this really kind of cool, positive, promotive effect of messages of pride. So first, I'll show you kids with low levels of pride socialization, so they didn't get a lot of pride from their parents. There was no relationship between private regard and classroom engagement. However, kids who got lots of pride socializations from their parents, lots of affirmations about their culture, customs, and who they were, we did see a positive association between private regard and their science classroom engagement. So it's indicative of the idea that pride socialization really helps to give you that positive sense of self, and subsequently where they're going to see enhanced STEM or science motivation in particular in classroom engagement. And then looking here at private regard with preparation for bias, we did see that significant main effect of private regard again that we saw before. So higher levels of private regard, higher levels of classroom engagement, no effective preparation for bias though, and there was no significant interaction. Okay, now looking at public regard. So remember, public regard is other people's perceptions of your group. What we found here was with ethnic racial public regard, there was a significant effect of ethnic racial public regard. So the more positively you thought other people viewed your group, the more likely you were to be engaged in the science classroom, okay? And pride socialization as well, we did see a significant effect. So higher levels of messages of pride for these kids, higher levels of engagement, but no significant interaction for that one. And then finally here, again, we see that significant main effect of ethnic racial public regard, which we saw before, but we do see a significant interaction between public regard and preparation for bias. And so I'm going to show you what that interaction looked like. Okay, so to show you what this looks like here and explain this one, what we found was that kids who received high levels of preparation for bias, so their parents talked to them a lot about the fact that they could be experiencing discrimination on the basis of their group, specifically being Cherokee, there was no relationship between public regard and classroom engagement. However, for kids who received low levels of bias, preparation for bias from their parents, their parents didn't really touch on this or talk about it very much. We do see a positive association between public regard and classroom engagement. And I think that this one really makes sense too, right? Because you're thinking about public regard and how other people view your group. And if you don't have a lot of preparation for bias, then we should see a positive association between public regard and classroom engagement. But if you've been hearing about how people might be discriminating against you for a long time and for a lot of time, we might not see that relationship then kind of exist between public regard and classroom engagement. So just to kind of go over what we learned here, a more positive ethnic racial identity was related to greater classroom engagement. So this was, one of the first times we were able to show this in the literature, and I'm really glad that we have that representation there now, especially given kind of the historical context of the boarding schools that I talked about. Thinking about socialization as a moderator, we found mixed evidence about the ways that socialization can moderate this relationship. First, that more pride socialization, there was a stronger link between private regard and engagement, but for more preparation for bias, there was a weaker link between public regard and classroom engagement. So it just kind of depends on the dimensions that you're looking at as to what extent these different forms of socialization can be influencing these relationships. Okay, so now I want to get into my final study here. And this is really my applied, most translational research. And this is where I really started to get in for the first time, looking at kind of doing community engaged research. And this was kind of really where I really kind of dug in. And it was years in the making to be able to establish this relationship and this collaboration with the Eastern Band. Took so much time. They have their own IRB, which is really awesome to vet and make sure that this is research that they want. But then also just to be able to, talk with people. That's why I went into the schools and talked to teachers, talked to administrators, talked to parents to learn about what were the needs of the community, right? What are some of the needs that they were seeing? And so what they were saying was that, our kids, we don't know if they're necessarily feeling that motivated, especially in STEM domains, like they don't necessarily see that it's something that's for them. That's kind of what I kept hearing. This was a theme that I was hearing, that this is not for them. These were the words that I was hearing from these teachers, school administrators, and parents. And so because of that, I started to develop an intervention around how we could find ways to make identities congruent with academic motivation and achievement, specifically around STEM domains, to try to help boost STEM motivation. So we know from the past 25 years, there's been only a very small narrowing of the ethnic, racial, and gender achievement gaps in the United States. The achievement gaps can be observed as early as elementary and middle school. So for ethnic, racial, minority groups in the United States, Native Americans consistently have the lowest math and science achievement scores, and the achievement gaps in math and science really begin to appear as early as 4th grade. Among gender, we see that boys begin to outperform girls in math and science in the 8th grade. And this gap only widens as they move through secondary and post-secondary education. So I was really, this was in graduate school, but I was really shocked to learn about these gaps. But then I was also kind of motivated by these gaps to say, you know, what can we do as psychologists specifically to try to find ways that we could intervene to help mitigate these gaps? What kind of interventions can we use to help, you know, improve the lives of kids in these ways and close these gaps in achievement? Well, fortunately, as a social identity scholar, this is something that I was interested in. And thinking about the increased importance of identity in adolescence, I thought this would be a great opportunity to use identities as a means of trying to ways that we could enhance motivation in these kids. We also know that these identities are related to lots of different outcomes, including educational outcomes. And so I thought this would be a good avenue or means to do that. And one way that we can do that is through what's called identity congruence. And this comes from identity-based motivation theory, which suggests that if you think that your identity is congruent with academic success or success in a specific domain, you're going to be more motivated to engage in that domain, just because you view that part of you as congruent with success in that domain. You're going to be more likely to engage in it, right? You feel like you have the efficacy to engage in that, all right? And so I thought this would be a really promising avenue for an intervention, right? To try to see if we can take identities and shape them to be congruent with academic success, specifically STEM success for these kids. And so I did that through the integration of actually these 3 different theories here. And I'll explain them in how I did this exactly through this in this intervention. But through role model theory, identity-based motivation theory, and self-affirmation theories, I kind of made this intervention. So I want to show you what the kids were doing for this intervention. Okay. So they were engaging what's called a self-affirmation task. And first, these kids were reading biographies about a successful STEM scientist. And this is the female native scientist and the male native scientist, okay? And these biographies, I don't expect you to read them. I'll tell you what they say. They're completely identical, so they're fictitious, and the kids didn't know that. We told them afterwards. But what these are, and this is Dr. Lindsay Youngbird, Dr. Lance Youngbird. And what these say is that the scientist was an enrolled member of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. They were born in Cherokee, North Carolina, and that they were interested in science from a young age. They then went on to university to get a bachelor's, master's, and a Ph.D. And now they work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to engage in research with fish and wildlife and biology. And they also like to help kids learn about STEM domains today. And so they both say that, except for the differences is just in the names of that. And so then they had to take 3 traits from this word bank. And these traits are all really positive. So it's like curious, flexible, optimistic, smart, kind. They had to pick 3 of these traits from that word bank that they saw there. And they had to write an essay or a self-affirmation of themselves. And they did that and I wanted them to try to link themselves with the scientists that they just read about. So they picked 3 words, and they had to write 4 sentences explaining how they shared those traits with the scientists that they just read about. So it's really linking themselves, with the scientists that they read about and affirming themselves positively to kind of make themselves more congruent with their identity with these scientists. This was an experimental manipulation, and we looked at differences in matching of identity. So I also had some white folks as well. And so this is Dr. Lindsay Williams and Dr. Lance Williams, and they were just born in the neighboring town. They weren't from the reservation, but they were just the exact same biography. And then we had them engage in an affirmation with the white female scientist or white male scientist, okay? So I had 2 main questions with this intervention study. First was just engaging in that self-affirmation task, no matter who they were matched to in the intervention, would we see a boost in STEM motivation? So just engaging with a scientist that was successful in STEM, would we see an effect of the intervention? That's the first question. But next, I was really more interested in this question, which was, what's the additive effect of matching with a STEM scientist on the efficacy of that intervention, right? So, and I hypothesized, of course, that those who received role models that they were matched to on both ethnicity and gender, we would see the strongest effects of the intervention, right? So if it was a native female 7th grader, and she read about the native female scientist, we would see strongest effects of the intervention in that condition compared to those that were matched on others or not matched at all, okay? So it's the same sample, but there were 3 time points to this intervention. There was pre-intervention, where we took a baseline assessment of the measures that we were interested in. There was 4 that I'll talk about in just a second. And then there was the intervention, where they actually did the self-affirmation task, where they wrote that essay about how they shared those traits with the scientist. That happened 3 weeks later. And then 1 week after that, we did a post-intervention follow-up. That was just to see if there was like a 1-week kind of lag or residual effect of the intervention that we could possibly see. For the self-affirmation task, that essay that the kids were writing about, there were 4 experimental conditions. There was also 1 control condition where the kids just wrote about what they did that morning. And then all of the conditions were grade, gender, and school balanced. Okay, so these were the 4 different measures that we were interested in assessing as the outcomes of the intervention. So to see if the intervention was successful, these were the 4 kind of outcomes that we looked at pre and post the intervention. First is science self-efficacy. So even if the work in science class is hard, I can learn it. Science interest, science is exciting to me. Mastery approach goal orientations, I want to learn as much as possible in science class. And performance approach goal orientations, it's important for me to do better than other students in science class. This isn't a extrinsic form of motivation. These are more intrinsic forms of motivation. But we'll talk about that in a minute. But before I actually get into the results here, I really want to just read one of these self-affirmation essays to you to give you a bit of a flavor of what was talked about in these essays, and also because I really love bringing the voices of my participants to my research. So I'm going to read to you this self-affirmation essay. And this was with a 7th grade girl, and she was affirming herself with a native male scientist. Well, she chose, the 3 words she chose were generous, organized, and capable. And she said, "My scientist is generous because of the way that he wanted to protect the animals. Dr. Youngberg was organized by how he went to school and finished with a bachelor's, master's, and also a Ph.D. He is capable of finishing his schooling and believing that he could help the animals. How I'm capable is how I believe I can do. I am capable of anything I can. I'm organized by my OCD because I have to have everything done or in order. I am generous to my people and tribe or by helping out in any way that I can." So this is just an example of one of the essays that the kids wrote for the self-affirmation task. Okay, so to get to the results here, first, just engaging in that self-affirmation task, not taking into account who they were matched to, just looking at the efficacy of the self-affirmation task. What we found was at intervention and 1 week post-intervention, no effect of the intervention. So, just engaging in that self-affirmation task, there was no effect of the intervention. But looking more closely at this kind of additive effects in my second research question of looking at, if you're more matched to your role model that you read about, would we see a potential effect of the intervention compared to those kids who weren't as matched in terms of gender and ethnicity? And what we found is for these 3 outcomes, no effect of the intervention, at intervention, or 1 week post-intervention. However, we did find one effect at intervention and post-intervention for kids who were matched on ethnicity and gender. We did see significant increases in their performance approach orientation, that extrinsic form of motivation for those kids. So there was one effect that we did kind of uncover here with this study, but overall, I didn't recommend this as intervention to the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians and to their schools. And this was my first kind of moment in intervention research. My advisor did purely basic research, not community-based. And so I was just going in there and doing my thing and just trying to find ways that we could help out in this way. So I was really learning a lot. This was part of my dissertation research. But I have lots of ideas for the future, and I'm actually continuing this line of research thanks to funding from the Society for Research in Child Development of ways that we can kind of potentially enhance these interventions so we do see effects, right? So I'm thinking about increasing the number of affirmations. This was a one-shot deal with this intervention. Like I only had them affirm once, okay? That was a long shot, but I gave it a shot and it didn't work. So now we know that we probably are gonna need more, okay? Also increased timing of measurement. So I measured them right at intervention and 1 week post-intervention. And so I wanted to look at how are these things kind of maybe processes are unfolding over time, right? So what does this look like 6 months down the road or even a year down the road for these kids? In what way? More proximal role models. I mean, these people were so far advanced, like hindsight's 2020, Adam, come on. Like these are like really like far advanced people for these kids, right? So like, let's get a college student who's like super successful, right? And see if that maybe could be a more proximal role model for these kids, as opposed to someone who's got a PhD and has a job. And then finally, thinking about the developmental period, these were with early adolescents. Remember, these are middle schoolers. Social identities are just coming online, right? And so perhaps they're just too kind of early to be kind of intervening and working on. Maybe as they're a little bit more established in high schoolers, I think this could be more developmentally appropriate for these kids. But the gears are turning for the future as I think about what's going on and what I wanted to continue to do in my research. Some things that I'm really interested in looking at is kind of developing interventions, identity-based interventions. I'm going to continue that line of research. We're kind of interested in kind of trying to find ways we could mitigate the negative effects of historical traumas and losses that we know our kids have experienced in Indigenous communities. I've also become increasingly interested in looking at the role of social media in identity development, especially as access to these smaller populations. Sometimes kids don't live on reservations and they don't have, their neighbors aren't all Native American and they can go to the powwow easily and have easy access, but they can on their cell phones. And they can engage in identity development on their cell phones, right? And so that's something that I want to try to look into and try to understand is how is social media kind of influencing identity development for kids. And with that, I just want to acknowledge my fabulous collaborators, my community partners, the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, the American Indian Center at UNC Chapel Hill, the adolescents in schools who participated in this study, universities that have supported me, my Pride Lab, and the funding agencies who helped make this research possible. Follow me on Twitter, thanks.
So we will take questions from the room, and also there's been quite a few submitted online, which I know Dr. Hoffman, if you are tuning in online, he's offered to, if you have questions, you want to reach out to him via email after, he's happy to answer those too if we don't get to them. Any questions in the room? Okay. Oh, yes, Jane. Wait, hold on, let me bring you.
Great presentation. I love your style too. I keep going back to like an early slide about the lack of research in this population and the number of publications. And we tried to engage a Native population in Western New York in a study that I was doing. And we had such a hard time gaining access. They're so protective. And I mean, just curious, what advice you give to people to study this population? And did you have those kinds of, I mean, you talked about getting into the schools and relationship building, and it took a while. So what are your thoughts about that?
Absolutely, that's a wonderful question, and something that is difficult, right? This is something like, you want to try and help serve these populations, but they are protective for lots of really great reasons. And so how do we kind of, try to work with these communities and engage with them as much as we can? I think for me, it was really helpful that I had kind of a partner at the university that I was at. So I was doing this research at the University of North Carolina, and I had the American Indian Center at University of North Carolina, and they were kind of able to be, a bit of a liaison for me in that way to kind of, they vetted me first at the American Indian Center and said, okay, Adam's good people, he's doing good work, and we think that this is someone. They actually formally wrote a letter of recommendation to the tribe to be able to do that. And so then from there, then I was able to then go and meet and just start to meet with people. And I think that's the biggest thing, is just meet with people, get FaceTime as much as possible. And really the biggest thing that I learned out of the whole thing is to engage in what I call walking softly and listening carefully. And so that means just going in there with like a very, a heart of service and, attitude of service, and just saying, I'm here for you, talk to me about what the needs are. And not coming in with a research agenda is actually something that's really important. And that was helped me to be successful. So like I said, I just said, I'm interested in doing research with the Eastern Band. And they said, okay. And then I started talking to people. And then from there, then I could say, okay, I've had these discussions with these people in the community. Here's what I'm hearing. What do you guys think? Do you think this is something that would be good for you? And I actually met with the IRB to talk to them about those things. And they had suggestions for me, and that were really, really great, that, even more insights that I was able to engage with. And then from there, actually then could implement the study. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hoffman. This was a great presentation, and thanks for sharing it. I think this is an area that has been less studied. So I think I have two questions, but please feel free to just share any thoughts about any of them.
Sure.
So first, on the study that you were researching the effects of ethnic identity on educational outcome, how did you control for the effects of other variables? Because on educational outcomes, other variables such as economic status of the family or their health baselines, nutrition, technology facility, all those are affecting. Was there any other items on the list of the questionnaires? And the other one is when you were talking about the differences between the genders, it was very interesting and surprising for me. And my understanding is that those three middle schools were schools where they are in places that they are all for the same identity. They're all Indian Americans. I'm very curious to see if you yourself or any other studies have looked at when you're looking at a certain ethnic or cultural identity within a bigger cultural identity and seeing how they see themselves, because, and especially in terms of the genders, my understanding or just very personal experiences was that females tend to more easily assimilate or associate with the bigger picture of the culture that they're in as opposed to the boys, which I think your study was showing differently. I was wondering if the context and the setting was different, like if you were looking at a minority within the bigger majority, that would be different or not.
Yeah.
Thanks again.
Great questions. Yeah, so great questions. So I controlled for, in the study, I controlled for all the information that I had was gender, grade, and school. So we controlled for the fact whether or not it was a tribal or public school. And that is to say the tribal school was about 95% Cherokee. Some generally white kids can come in because of like siblings and like marrying, intermarrying, and those kinds of things. And then the white kid could come in. But generally it's a very Cherokee context, the tribal school is. Whereas the public schools, they are an ethnic racial minority to white, but they are the largest racial ethnic minority, the Cherokee are in those schools. And so I was able to look at and test for significant differences, and we actually didn't see any significant differences on the basis of the schools, and the controls never came out significant either for the type of school that these kids came from in the models. So that contextual factor didn't seem to be super important. I am working on a study that kids actually from the public schools did report significantly more stereotypes about Cherokee or American Indians compared to kids that were at the tribal school. So there's that kind of protective effect of the school in that context of being at a tribal school compared to being at some of those public schools. But for these studies, it was not actually a big factor or important in that way. Yeah. There's some questions on Zoom, or should I just get them later? Or?
So that actually covered a couple that were asking about differences between the public,
the context,
the context of the schools, and also just lots of people saying like, "Thank you for doing this work," and it seems like a really great approach to be able to engage with this population. Otherwise, I think we're all out of time. Okay. So if people online want to submit their other kind of more specific questions, I encourage them to do so. Please join me in thanking Dr. Hoffman for this talk.